Good afternoon and welcome to Hemmings Club 54. I'm your host, John Nickerson. This afternoon, we're going to talk about some cars from the 1980s, and we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests. Brad Brownell, of course, is the co-founder of Radwood and an automotive journalist with a passion for the sketchy and unloved, which sounds like most of the other guests on this panel. Brad brings an encyclopedic knowledge of the odd and arcane to our panel, and we're thrilled to have him. Brad, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Jason Cammisa, of course, needs little introduction, but we'll give him one anyway. He's now creating video content for Hagerty's media division. Jason is among the most influential and respected American automotive journalists working today and is known for his brutally honest automotive takes. His reviews aren't opinion pieces. They're framed around a deep technical knowledge and background, which he then translates to the audience in plain English with an equal dose of comedy for good measure. His award-winning 2-decade career has earned him senior and technical editor positions at several major U.S. car magazines, hundreds of millions of YouTube views, and a large and fervent social media following. Jason, we're thrilled you're here.
I am feeling odd and arcane, so thank you for having me.
Well, Brad will like you at least. Terry McGean, of course, has been involved in automotive media for as long as Brad has been alive, having worked at Enthusiast magazine publishers on both coasts during that time. He started wrenching on cars as a teen, worked as a mechanic in college, and eventually went to automotive publishing during the 1990s. He's worked at numerous magazines, including Hot Rod, Carcraft, and Rod and Custom. For the last 15 years, though, he's been with Hemmings and currently serves as editor-in-chief of Hemmings Motor News and editor of Hemmings Muscle Machines. Terry, how are you?
Good, John. Thanks for having me.
And last, and certainly least, Mike Musto left behind a career as a web designer in the financial sector of Lower Manhattan to play with cars for a living, and fortunately has never looked back. He is straight talking. He is a rabid automotive enthusiast with a deep affinity for all things mechanical. He's the executive producer, host, and director of new media for Hemmings, and has been a fixture in the automotive community for over a decade. And with this is an amazing number, 3,500 articles to his credit and 2 original automotive series, The House of Muscle and Big Muscle, garnering over 75 million views. Mike is a fantastic font of knowledge. He's got a straight shooting, no nonsense style, and he's going to be a fantastic addition to this panel. Mike, how are you?
Good, man. Good.
So, Brad, there's that wisdom. Brad, except for you, every one of the other guests on this panel here today came of age during the 1980s. I think all the rest of us have graduated or graduated high school within a kind of 10-year span. But you are the patron saint, dare I say, of this decade through your work with Radwood. How does that start without that direct affinity like we had?
Because that was what was available when I came of age, driving age. You know, that was what I could afford. That's what I could work on. Those are the cars that I grew up with. So the thing that I love about the 80s was that stuff was new enough. It had fuel injection and ABS and stuff like that you could drive it every day, but it's simple enough that if you're a shade tree mechanic like myself, you can still work on it yourself and fix whatever goes wrong with it when you buy a $2,000 car for driving around in high school.
Yeah, and Terry, the 80s are an interesting decade because they actually span a lot of technical innovation. It starts off kind of slow. It's probably the first decade of automobiles that you can really drive every day without having to worry about them. You've got, as Brad said, you've got the addition of fuel injection in most cars. We had turbocharging. It's the arrival of passive restraints. How do you see the 80s develop kind of from the very beginning, which is really a carryover of the 70s into kind of this modern era car like, you know, Brad gets on the lawn at Radwood every time?
Yeah, I really feel like the 80s was sort of a rebirth of good times for the automobile because the mid to late 70s were just terrible. It was just the darkest time for cars in this country anyway. And yeah, the 80s started a little weak, but by 1982, things are starting to get interesting again. And then, as you say, technologies are coming in, fuel injection starting to become common, overdrive transmissions, suspensions are getting better, brakes are getting better, cars are just driving better. Power is starting to catch up. So by the late decade, there were some really pretty great cars being built. So it was really a good time, I think, to renew everybody's faith in the automobile. The beginning of the decade, I think most people felt like, well, that's it. Cool cars are done. Now this is just transportation.
Well, it's interesting, Jason, the picture you sent in of you as a kid is fascinating. One, for the fact that how similar you look now to how you do then, but you're standing behind a Peugeot 505, and I'm not sure if it's an STI or not, what I think about the 80s is there was still so much diversity in that decade with a lot of manufacturers present. Obviously, there are a lot fewer now. What is it that speaks to you about the decade?
By the way, that was an STX V6 because my mother had
Ooh.
really good taste in cars, still does.
She did.
She used it to replace, to your point, a Saab 900 Turbo. So there are two brands that are no longer for sale in the U.S. And there was a huge diversity in the car market then. And I think to Terry's point, the 80s probably saw more improvement in the automobile than any of the preceding 4 or 5 decades. So the stuff that was, something that came out in 1980 was very different than something that came out in 1986. And we haven't really seen that since. Until the last couple of years where we've seen a drop off where the cars are no longer about the enthusiasts, they're no longer about the drivers. So I'm going to agree with Brad for the first time ever. The 80s was that perfect mix of cars that were just raw enough and just involving enough that we could really enjoy them. But the computers that they did have were there to help the car do exactly what we wanted to do, not to override us. So it was the magic recipe.
It's amazing, Mike. As kind of the representative of all things American here, although you really do have diverse taste, I have heard stories that I thought were apocryphal and weren't about car dealers in the 70s timing the departure of a new car off the lot with the green light down the streets to ensure it didn't stall. Quality was horrible in the 70s. To both Jason and Terry's points, it got so much better. What is it about the decade's cars that kind of creates that level of excitement in you that you might not have had for cars from the 70s or the malaise era?
Well, I think, when I was in high school, it was the 1980s. So the whole part was, when things like Grand Nationals came out with like actual turbocharging and intercooling, or things like Cyclones, and then we had like F40s and stuff like that, that really made a massive difference, to enthusiasts like us. I mean, when you came out of the 1970s, cars then, especially in the late 70s, were just pure garbage. And they just were. If they were American, they were garbage. Overseas, the European cars, they were so much better. Like, I mean, to give you an example, I have a 79 BMW and a 79 Trans Am. The build quality between both, it's astonishing. The BMW still drives like a mini Panzer tank, and it is solid and it's secure, and it's still to this day an amazing automobile. The Trans Am, not so much. Like, everything was kind of falling apart when it was new, and just continued to do so for the next 40 years. So, it was this decade of, oh my God, we actually can go back and build great stuff again. And the technology is there to let the owner have fun again. Right. But enhance that experience through technology, sales, marketing, and all that other fun stuff. So, and everything else that was going on, the excess of the 80s, having been there, especially working down in Lower Manhattan, best thing ever.
Well, it's interesting. I never thought about American cars from that era as, the analog to leprosy, where they're dying a little bit every day, shedding parts. But it is true, that era, that 79 BMW is still a relatively modern car. I would never describe a 79 Pontiac as such. You had, Terry, in the 80s, I think the Chrysler made a great deal of hay from their 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty. And the thought of having that kind of warranty in the middle of the 70s, I guess, would be kind of ludicrous to think about. What allowed kind of American manufacturers to catch up on the quality front with the Japanese or the Europeans?
In the 80s, I think what happened in the 70s in large part was the Americans were being bombarded with regulations that they weren't prepared to meet, and which, frankly, I don't think they met in the best way. A lot of the emissions control devices on 70s cars are just band-aids, and they just kept making the same engines they'd been making since the 50s or 60s and trying to make this stuff work. I think they might have taken a page from the Europeans and the Japanese even by the time the 80s were dawning. And we really need to make this stuff function better, and not just try to patch it together and get it through a smog test. So emission control devices improve. Of course, fuel injection helps with that a lot, but there were even carbureted cars in the 80s that worked much better. And just quality control did seem to come back on a lot of American cars, not all of them, but I think the Americans were just getting their act together. They certainly were put on the run by the Japanese. but it felt something like a rebound in the early 80s. And then as the decade wore on, it felt like they were just getting their legs under them again and making better cars.
Well, what's interesting, Brad, we kind of equate, at least most automotive enthusiasts of a certain age, equate performance with rear wheel drive. But the 80s really are the era of front wheel drive performance cars. And I think at Radwood, you really see a lot of those representatives. What are some of your favorites from that front wheel drive revolution that took place during the decade?
I mean, you got to go with the icons. You got the GTI was born in the 70s, but really came of age in the 80s. You've got the turbo Dodges. They were above and beyond anything that Dodge had built for the prior decade, as far as speed and performance were concerned. Shelby even put his hand in on some of those, and I've been a fan for decades. One of my dreams is to get a GLHS, but that's neither here nor there. Front wheel drive performance was the thing. All the Hondas, all the German stuff. It was great.
Well, Jason, from that decade, talking about some of those front wheel drive cars, do they still hold up? Gosh, I hate to say this, 40 years later or 30 something years later, as performance cars?
All it takes is for me to take someone for a ride in my Scirocco, and it will shut them up. The best example I can give you is we did a track day at Grattan Raceway in Michigan with for a bunch of us at Automobile. I had my Scirocco there, and Car and Driver had 15 of their web interns there at the same time, and we had a CLK AMG Black Series. We had some and a Lotus Elise. We had some pretty major cars there. And after I did one lap sideways in a front wheel drive car, their boss, this wonderful friend of ours named Mike Duchesne, said to all the kids, "You need to watch this because that's proof that front wheel drive cars, when they were light enough, could be made to handle properly." And what happened was I did fun runs the entire day in the VW. No one cared about the Black Series. No one cared about the Porsches. No one cared about all the rest of the stuff. Absolutely, they hold up because they were light. They were simple. They had a reasonable amount of horsepower. And there was an emphasis on fun that we just don't have today.
Well, Jason, you said it. Yeah,
sorry.
Brad.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Citation X11, one of the best driving cars of all time.
Just shut up. Shut up.
All right. So, Brad, I came this close to muting you. If you were going to say Ford Escort XR5, you were done. You were going to be cut off for the rest of this conversation.
XR5 bad, XR4 Ti good, although that was really
that's true.
Yeah,
right. And I was trying to think, there was a Mercury version of the Escort that came in a performance version, which I think was it essentially is a Lynx, an LN7 or something like that, or an EXP that had like the frog headlights. Jason is brilliant for many reasons, but one thing he said that's particularly compelling, Mike, is light. Now, the 80s were the last decade. I think safety equipment in the 80s were really related to side impact door beams. You didn't have a lot of extra structure in the car. Airbags didn't come along until later in the decade. Mike, what is the difference, I guess, between the light cars of that decade and the heavier cars that come after in terms of a driving experience?
Well, I mean, I think it goes to a manufacturer and kind of where the cars are produced. So, like, to give you an example, not too long ago, I had an 86 Porsche 928S that Jason is very familiar with and Brad knows about too. And that car back then was considered the big Porsche. It was the big, heavy Porsche. It weighed 3,300 pounds. By today's standards, what does a new 911 weigh, right? So you're talking about how things have just gotten big and bloated and fat and overweight. So the 80s kind of introduced us to what lightweight combined with performance could be. And that doesn't matter if it was rear wheel drive, front wheel drive, or all wheel drive, right? Because it was kind of that sweet spot where you didn't have all the side impact protection. You didn't have all the crash protection. You didn't have the airbags, the electronics and everything. So, we talk about cars and technology. The 80s was a very pure decade for performance because while we were still figuring it out, it was getting better and better and better. And it just kept doing that. Turbocharging is a perfect example of that. I mean, I had an 81 Turbo Trans Am, which was probably one of the worst turbo cars ever made. But then fast forward, 7 years or 8 years, and you're talking about turbocharged cars like the Buick Grand National and the GMC Typhoon and stuff like that. or the Cyclone. And now all of a sudden you've got real performance with less weight and, numbers that made, I think, every automotive enthusiast go, Jesus, this is getting good now. So
it is. And what's interesting is how, especially with American cars, the paradigm for performance changed. Terry, in the 60s and early 70s, they did that through cubic inches. But American cars like the Grand National or the Mustang SVO, and I guess you can give me probably another dozen representatives, managed to do it with a different formula. And why are those cars so compelling compared to some of their legendary forebears?
Well, that technology was kind of forced on the Americans, right? And the car that Mike just mentioned, the 8081 Turbo Trans Am, was a terrible car, but it had a very forward-looking approach to making power. It was a wise idea. These guys knew we can't keep using 400 cubic inch engines. Well, we'll use a smaller engine. We'll put a turbocharger on it. On paper, it performed as well as the last 400 Pontiac Power Trans Am 79. In reality, it didn't. But as Mike said, I mean, that technology was developing rapidly. And Buick, of course, we all know they leaned on it. They had their first Turbo Regal, I think, for production in 78.
83? Oh, was it that early?
Yeah. You could get it with a 2-barrel or 4-barrel carburetor, and they weren't great, but they seemed to sell a bunch of them. There used to be a lot of them around. And of course, we get in the 80s, they had fuel injection, they had an intercooler, they had better engine management, and they wind up with the quickest car in America, unfortunately, just in time for the platform to be killed. But then 89, they resurrect that engine and make it a little better in the Turbo Trans Am, which is a limited run car. But I think it's interesting how the 8081 Turbo Trans Am and the 89 Turbo Trans Am, same model car, they bookend the decade. The first was terrible. The last was pretty great. And same idea, let's use a smaller engine and boost it. But from the beginning of the decade to the end, they really kind of got it right using that technology.
Yeah, it's amazing what else changes in the decade. And Brad, I don't want to make you the standard bearer for younger automotive enthusiasts everywhere, but I look at 70s cars, in my mind as being relatively modern. That's not true. But I think you can make the case that 80s cars are relatively modern looking. They don't have chrome bumpers like the early 70s cars do. The shapes of them really change. You start to get aerodynamics really kind of at the forefront. The 80s, I think, are the decade that are responsible for the Ford Taurus and the Ford Tempo and the Mercury Topaz, which really changed kind of the paradigm for how designers look at incorporating these things. For a younger enthusiast, what are the kind of iconic designs that came out of the 80s that are kind of remembered today?
I think as far as enthusiasts are concerned, anything with box flares. You're looking at stuff like 944s, Starions.
Yeah.
30 M3s.
M3.
Yeah, M3s, Audi Quattros, that kind of stuff. Like the 80s, particularly the earlier 80s, were a lot more about that boxy, wedgy. They were just coming out of the wedge of the 70s and going into the rounded oval of the 90s. So there was still a little bit of box, but it was more aerodynamic. So there was a lot of aerodynamic and style advancements made in the 80s that carry on as icons through to today.
And it's funny too, talking about icons, and Jason and Mike, I'm going to have you guys actually kind of respond to this question first, and then the two old guys, Terry and I, can kind of chime in later. You had this kind of proliferation of automobiles in popular culture during the 80s. You had, of course, the DeLorean appearing in Back to the Future. You had KITT on TV. You had the MGB doing its star turn as a Ferrari 250 California in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You had the shirt I'm wearing an homage for, a Magnum PI's Ferrari 308. How much did that affect you guys as younger enthusiasts going up through the decade of seeing some of these cars on the big or small screens?
You want to go first or you want me to go first?
Yeah, let me go first because it's quick
Jason
and
looks
easy.
incredulous.
I'm immune to it. If I you list off a bunch of epic cars that I remember. Obviously, I watched every episode of Knight Rider. Did I ever buy any of those cars? Did they mean anything to me? No. So it just means I'm just impossible to market to. And so we're going to go to, let's talk to Mike, who's a little bit less savvy of a.
Well, I think I think the big difference is the world was a much smaller place, right? You didn't have phones, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have that. So when you saw one of those cars, say you saw a Countach in person, or or any Ferrari, a 308 or a DeLorean, it was an event that you would talk about for months. You talk to your friends and be like, "Do you remember when I saw that Countach 4 months ago?" Because they weren't available. They were these mystical beasts that you never ever saw. And I remember the first time I ever saw a Testarossa in person, and I lost my mind. I was like, "Oh my God." And I talked about it for months because back then it was an event. And that was in the decade of poster cars. That's when everybody had a Countach or a Testarossa or a 959 or 911 or whatever it was on their wall. And they were unobtainium, right? Unless you had all the money, they were unobtainium. And I mean, I know where I grew up in Brooklyn, like that was, you saw a Ferrari in Brooklyn, that was head exploded all over the wall. So as opposed to your typical, Cadillac or Lincoln or Nova or whatever the case was. So I think from that standpoint, they left an impression, at least on me, they did. Yes, like Miami Vice and Ferris Bueller and all those shows were instrumental, but it was the seeing them in person that had more of an effect back then than it does now.
Right. Terry, what about you?
The cars on TV and in movies, I've always been real keen on, but I kind of feel like Jason, like I liked what I liked. I watched Knight Rider too, but I think I was, 12 or 13 when that show came out. I'm still a ways away from being able to drive. And I kind of knew, yeah, that car's really not that fast. It's kind of cool looking. I remember being like 8 years old and watching Starsky and Hutch, and people were real excited about that Torino. And I laugh when I think back on this. I think I knew when I was 8 years old that car's not fast. That car is not cool. But conversely, when the Dukes of Hazzard came out when I was like 11 and I saw they had a 69 Charger, I was like, wow, that's so cool that's a Charger. It was an old car already, but I liked it. The DeLorean from Back to the Future, that was a cool idea, but I remember seeing the DeLorean at the New York Auto Show again when I was like 12 or 11 or 10 when it first came out. And I thought it was a great looking car and the stainless steel was real cool. But even then I was like, that engine, that's kind of a disappointment. So I guess I'll echo kind of what Jason said. I like seeing cars on TV. There's ones I like and ones I don't care so much about. TV didn't make me like the cars though. I kind of liked what I liked.
Well, Brad, I'm going to ask you a question for a movie that came out before you were born. In Back to the Future, the garage door opens up at the end of the movie and Marty McFly looks at a Toyota SR5 pickup truck. And I think for enthusiasts that were older, that would have been a sports car in the 70s or the 60s. And the fact that it was a pickup truck in the middle of the 80s, did that have an effect on kind of the proliferation of pickup trucks now as collectible vehicles?
That's a wide-ranging question. It might have sparked some people to get into the truck world. I think a lot of it had more to do with regulations and what people could afford and wanting to have tall, big things on the road and all that. But yeah, that might have been what kicked it off. The mini truck stuff of the 80s was, it's one of my favorite subgenres of stuff to have at a Radwood or even to see, out on the road, which is pretty uncommon. But yeah, trucks have always been part of American community. They're the backbone of the country. They help, everything get where it needs to go.
Well, I agree, but it's interesting. The 80s gave us so many unique trucks. You had, the Japanese trucks, which we consider very small today. You had the Suzuki Samurai, you had the Mitsubishi Montero. You kind of had the first generation of Japanese sport utility vehicles.
And they were all really good off-road too. That was the thing, was like, you could actually take those off-road as opposed to like a F-150 from the 60s that would shake itself apart if you drove it down a dirt road.
Well, yeah, I agree. Mike, what do you think is responsible for kind of the growth of trucks as a legitimate collector segment of the hobby?
I think a lot of it is kind of where you grew up and how you grew up, right? I think there were some people that were exposed to trucks at an early age and you looked at them as utility vehicles. But then it was the first decade where you would ever look at a truck as a performance vehicle. Like when the Cyclone and the Typhoon came out, to me, that was a stroke of genius by General Motors, because here's this Cyclone pickup truck, which was basically just an S10, and then you had a Chevy Blazer that they morphed into the Typhoon, and they went 0 to 60 in like under 5 seconds. They beat every exotic on the planet in a straight line. And they were literally like the plastics on the inside would have the rigidity of a ramen noodle if you touch them. So it's like they were straight garbage, but at the same token, oh my God, did that change the opinion of what a truck could be capable of? And that spawned a whole thing of, yes, it's still usable. But my God, is it fast? And you saw trucks evolve. You saw, the Dodge Ram SRT. You saw the Ford Lightning. You saw all of these trucks. And it even started back in the 70s with like Dodge's Little Red Express. It's like people always knew there was that kind of performance thing there. And I think the 80s was the first decade to really exploit that and make people aware of it.
Mike, if I could jump in there, I would say one thing that I remember happening with the kind of the muscle trucks was that as the 80s were going on, rear-wheel drive cars were going away. And I recall
totally.
that people were looking at trucks because it's like, hey, trucks are like cars used to be. They still have V8 engines and rear-wheel drive. I mean, I know the Typhoon obviously and the Cyclone didn't, but it was almost as if the desire to have a traditional platform made a lot of people look over at trucks for performance.
It's a great point.
Which we've kind of lost that in time now because now trucks are just, they're part of everyday life for everybody. But
but think about what happens when you hear a V8 screaming. You're sitting at a restaurant outside, eating outside, and you hear a screaming V8. I turn around instinctively, and every single time it's a pickup truck.
Mm-hmm.
There are no kind of cool cars that you could drive every day that have a big screaming V8 in them. They're sort of all now turbocharged and they're quiet and they're just a very different thing. To your point, I think they still are the traditional Americana formula of front engine, rear drive, nice sonorous V8 making all kinds of great noises in traffic, and people don't want to get rid of them. I don't blame them.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing to think about kind of how pickup trucks have carried that mantle on. And Terry, that's a great point. I never even thought about that, but that really is the traditional kind of American performance formula. Front engine, rear wheel drive, V8, body on frame construction. It really is an interesting point. And, we talked about a little bit earlier about how quality shifted during the decade. And we had a lot more manufacturers present in a lot more diversity, but we also had a lot of new manufacturers arrive on the scene. And towards the end of the decade, we had the arrival of 3 Japanese brands with Lexus, Infiniti, and Acura. Jason, how did that change the kind of paradigm for manufacturers when you had these kind of upmarket performance brands from Japan, which is heretofore not where we would expect these cars to come from?
I mean, it's kind of hard for, I think, younger people to understand that the idea of a Japanese luxury car was something that people didn't accept in the 1980s, right? Japanese cars were cheap and chintzy and they were full of little gadgets, but they were ultimately not competitive. Lexus destroyed that. Lexus almost killed Mercedes, and Lexus single-handedly and permanently destroyed Mercedes' ability to lead with engineering at all cost. And the result is they homogenize the market. We no longer have a player, until Tesla, strangely enough, that is a decade ahead of everyone else in the way Mercedes was in the 1970s and 80s, because now you have a carbon copy of it, so to speak, the Lexus LS400, that was better than the Mercedes was for half the price. And all of a sudden, Mercedes is no longer able to say the car will cost what it costs depending on what the engineers say it costs. Now they have to build it to a price to compete with. They have real competition for the first time and change the whole market.
It's amazing. And Brad, now obviously, Lexus, Infiniti, and Acura are well-established brands. To Jason's point, did you ever give thought to the difference between Japanese cars or American cars or European cars, depending on the country of origin, in terms of their desirability?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, so yes, but certainly less than I imagined that it would have been in the 70s, 80s, and well into the 90s. I didn't buy my first car until 2003, so by that point, Japanese cars were well established, and but I didn't own one for a decade beyond that because I grew up in Michigan and everybody around me drove big 3 cars. So that's all that existed in Michigan, especially rural Michigan. I grew up on a dirt road, and my first few cars were Pontiacs, Fords. When I finally bought a TR7 as my first fun car, everyone around, my dad was like, "You're not parking that in our driveway
I don't blame him.
because that's not American made."
It was going to destroy the water table for 3 blocks in every direction.
Yes.
Hey, look, British cars are perfectly acceptable vehicles. And the thing about British cars is they are acceptable or should be acceptable to most Americans. Growing up, I wasn't allowed to drive any Axis cars. So that meant no cars from Japan, no cars from Italy, no cars from Germany. But the Brits were allies. And that's kind of how I developed my kind of affinity for them. But Mike, what did you think of Japanese cars during that decade?
I thought they were fine. I mean, one of my first cars that I ever got in high school was I bought an 84 300ZX, a Nissan 300ZX. And it was interesting because it was the first time that Datsun had changed to Nissan, and the car was actually dual badged. On the left side, it said Datsun. On the right side, it said Nissan. And it was basically the first time a manufacturer had tried to upsell by changing the name, right, in the United States. And they co-branded the car at that time. But back then, it was a technology beast. I mean, you'd open the door would go, "Your door is ajar," and it had automatic seat belts, and the dash was, a digital piano readout. Back then it was really cool. And it wasn't, you saw that technology go, they were turbocharged. Again, it was the first decade where I think performance from overseas started to come over, and we saw it, and the performance wasn't German. I think that was the biggest thing.
It's an interesting thing that you would bring up 300ZX, because I was going to say earlier, one of the biggest changes in the 80s was the dominance of the American car companies died off and was replaced by the imports. And where I grew up, same place that Mike grew up, 70s, everyone drove American cars. All of a sudden at the beginning of the 80s, people started to realize that there's a different way, and had been the fuel crisis and all this other stuff. That really encouraged people to say you can have more without compromise. And when you go back to 80s road tests, all you kept seeing, the dominant theme is we added, this 4-cylinder went to a 16-valve 4-cylinder, it gained horsepower and it gained MPG, and it's faster, and it does everything better. So even someone like Mike, who grew up in sort of, immersed in the American car world, came to the conclusion that actually the imports were the better place to be at that point. So Terry? It's interesting that you wound up with a ZX.
Yeah. Terry?
I would say, Jason's absolutely right, of course, but I would say that the 80s really were the decade of the Japanese cars, going from, if you look at the 70s, in the beginning of the 70s, Japanese cars were straight up weird. Nobody had them. In New York, because I grew up in New York too. And when I was walking the streets of the Bronx, where we originally lived, looking at cars parked on the street, as I always did, there was one person in the neighborhood that had an early 70s Toyota. And I remember asking my parents, "What kind of car is that?" It was weird. Nobody had those cars. By the mid 70s, the Corolla started getting a little normal. The Accord came out. People had already taken to the Civic. The tide started to shift pretty quickly. And by the time you're in the 80s, people were really recognizing on a wide scale, these are really nice cars. I remember driving like an 81 Honda Accord and just being blown away by what a nice little car it was. And at the same time, Americans, I think in general, were getting pretty angry at their American cars, because like Mike said earlier, American cars in the mid to late 70s were trash.
Garbage.
They were engineered badly, and then they were built badly on top of that. And people were tired of it. And Japanese cars were evolving so quickly and just becoming so nice. And people, I think Americans thought, little 4-cylinder cars, they're not really very nice to drive. And then here were these Japanese cars that were comfortable. They got great gas mileage. They were super reliable, and they were actually fun to drive. So they really just blew everybody away during that period.
Brad, on a typical Radwood lawn or gathering, what are the cars, I think, of the Japanese era, that 80s era, that are some of the lesser known lights that people kind of forget about? Things like, I don't know, the FX16 Corollas versus the standard AE86 Corollas, or things like that, that young people really gravitate towards.
Honestly, anything that's still clean. Finding something that, it also depends on where you are across the country. We've seen completely different shows in Philadelphia as to what we see in Los Angeles or in Austin, Texas. It really depends on the market, but there's a ton of stuff being imported right now that was never sold here. So you've got a lot of like Toyota Crowns and a lot of the the big luxury sedans that were big in Japan but never made it here. Nissan Leopards and all that kind of stuff. There's the weird and the wild stuff. A friend of mine has a 200SX convertible that they only built like 25 of, or an M30 Infinity. What did we see? We saw like a restored early CRX that did like amazing. There was a Geo Metro convertible. I know technically a American brand, but it's a Suzuki, whatever.
That goes to speak. The very fact that you mentioned the Geo Metro goes to speak to how much diversity existed. And I don't want to get too far along without actually asking you all about that kind of question. So, Jason, what is your favorite vehicle from this decade? The one that still excites you?
I have a lot of them, but I think the defining car for the decade, from my perspective, is the E30 BMW 3 Series, and the reason why is it was BMW, certainly BMW of North America's opportunity to finally figure out exactly what the market wanted. That E30 started out in 1982 production, 83 and 84 model year. 4-cylinder only, 2-door only. It didn't do well. It wasn't well reviewed. Didn't sell well, wasn't well received. It was just a bigger, fatter, heavier E21, which was a bigger, fatter, heavier 2002. And then it finally occurred to BMW in 1987, which was more than halfway through the product cycle, that if you throw a hot rod engine in it and one like, the BMW Straight Six in it, now you have invented and perfected the sports sedan. And so that car ranged from 82 until 92 in production, got continually better. And its last iteration, the 325i, I think became the defining car for the 80s sports sedan. So they're still wonderful to drive today. They're reliable. They're relatively inexpensive. I currently own 3 of them, which is a problem. But I think I love my Volkswagens. I have 80s Volkswagens also for different reasons, and I love them more for some reasons. But the defining car, I think, has to be that E30.
I agree. And it's funny you talk about them being bigger versions of the 2002 or the 320, but you look at an E30 BMW compared to a modern 3 Series or 4 Series, and you go, it is a fraction of the car.
A current 2 Series, which is effectively a 1 Series coupe, towers over my E30s like it's an SUV. It looks like it would be an X3. Genuinely, they're tiny.
It's amazing. And Mike, what's your favorite representative from this decade?
Probably the Countach, the Lamborghini, because that's the poster that I had on my wall. And also, I think like Cannonball Run was one of the first movies I saw that just blew me away, right? The opening scene of that movie was this black Countach being run down. Well, not run down, chasing being chased by a turbo Trans Am. And it was like the turbo Trans Am, it was between that and Smokey the Bandit, and the Countach. And it was excess to excesses, the 10th degree. And like I said, working, at the end of the 1980s and into the 90s down on Wall Street and seeing that culture, and you're talking about cocaine and the excess of cocaine and drugs and finance and everything else. That's what that car represented. It was just sheer excess. Even though the car was designed and started in the 70s, it came into its own in the late 80s, and it was excess for excess sake. Any type of money you wanted, any type of drug you wanted, any type of, anything it all came together in that one car. The 1980s is the Lamborghini Countach.
The emblematic Countach for me is a white Countach, opening the doors with cocaine falling out of it. It is one of those things that I think embodies or typifies the decade. And do you remember the posters that said decisions, decisions, decisions? And I don't know if I don't have kids, but if kids still have posters on their wall. But you're right, Mike. The 80s were the decade that you had car posters on the wall. And that's the thing you most likely were to have on your wall. Terry, what was the car that kind of spoke to you or still speaks to you?
Well, I said the 5-liter Mustang, which is not a super imaginative answer. But the reason that I look at that car is because even though the Fox platform Fords, they were hugely popular then, and they're becoming really popular now, not a technological tour de force, a very kind of blunt instrument. But what was great about them at the time was if you were interested in muscle cars as I was then, they were already old cars to us guys who were teenagers in the 80s. We were trying to resurrect what we could with our meager means. And then the 79 Mustang, mildly interesting, but not great. Then it got worse. 82, it starts to get interesting. 85 is when it really got good. And what was significant was that is kind of the point where those cars picked up kind of where the last era had left off. Like an 85 5-liter Mustang with a 5-speed is really not a compromise. And that's really what had been just beaten into everybody who liked cars, I think, in the 70s and early 80s. Everything is compromised now, particularly with American cars. That 85 5-liter Mustang was like, this thing's as fast as an old Mustang, and it's actually in some ways better. I will add, I'm going to echo Jason's feelings about the E30 M3. That, speaking of compromise, that car to me, when it came out, was like, wow, this is a complete no compromise car. There's nothing on this that, at least in my view at the time, was toned down because, oh my God, emissions and safety. That was like a straight up race car for the street. And we hadn't seen that in a long time. I worked at a BMW dealer in the summer of 1987 and 88. And I was standing in the showroom moving stuff around when the car carrier showed up with the first M3 on it that we got. And I didn't know what it was. Somehow I'd never seen it in a magazine. And it blew me away. And I remember we got it off the truck. They dropped it off for us. And we opened the hood. And my eyes probably got twice their normal size with that M Power intake manifold. I couldn't believe it. And again, a car that was amazing, that was not a compromise, at least to my eyes at the time in any way. And really, from all these years later, it really wasn't a compromise.
So, Brad, you weren't really around for much of the decade, at least not in walkable form. What's the car that you remember the best?
Well, there's an anecdote that's always gone around. I fell in love with German cars, and I've been a German car fanatic for most of my adult life, which compared to you guys, I know is relatively short, but
Hey.
But-
Well, I'm going to point out that you lost your hair before any of the old guys did. So
that is fair. I lost my hair in college, so yeah. But there's an anecdote that goes, everybody at Porsche had company cars. All of the marketing department had 911s. All of the engineers had 944s. And because it was a better chassis, it was better designed, it handled better. It was the modern sports car to me. And the turbo iteration is my favorite sports car of all time. I've been a fan for years. I have an 86, which I know is the worst year to get, but it's my favorite thing that I own. And, it's got 500,000 miles on it and still ticking. And to Terry's point, I actually had a 5-liter Mustang built in 86 with the 5-speed. It was a great car, but it didn't hold a candle to my 86 944. Completely better, hands down car in every way. So
I don't think any of us will argue that. Brad, I'm going to give you the same opportunity for your least favorite car from the decade.
I know I'm going to get roasted for this, but the DeLorean DMC-12, I just hate that car. It's an icon of the decade. I don't like it stylistically. I don't like how it drives. I don't like how it sounds. I'm not a fan.
Stylistically, hold on. I'm going to drop. You can insult that PRV V6. You can insult the terrible Lotus chassis. You can insult all of it. You want to insult the way it looks?
Mike,
maybe the rush
just doesn't do it for me.
Brad, Doc Brown is heading to your house right now. Is going to kick your door down. I completely agree with Jason. The PRV V6 is one of the worst engines ever made. To put it in a sporty car is just an automotive abortion. But stainless steel and gull wings, you don't think that's cool?
I'll admit that the doors are cool. That's probably the only good thing about it.
First of all, you just insulted my mother's Peugeot. Let's not forget. We're wrapping around the beginning. It's the same engine in it. Although the Peugeot had the even fire crankshaft that had 145 horsepower with L Jetronic instead of CIS. No, it's very interesting. I think that's a sign of age, to be honest with you, Brad. And I'm not making fun of you for being younger, but to us, that Giugiaro design was. First of all, my Scirocco is the same design, so you're also insulting my Scirocco. But that wedge-shaped design
works. I think it's just the bigger greenhouse.
It's just hilarious that I just don't think you'd find another person who was there in the 80s who remembers seeing what that thing looked like, regardless of the fact that it was a complete pile. I think we were all just so like, oh my God, this is what the future looks like, that we can't separate ourselves from it now. So to hear you say it's not pretty and the greenhouse, we're like, what? Shut up. It's fascinating.
I agree. I mean, it's, well, anyway, I'll just say, Brad, you're wrong. But Mike, what do you have a least favorite one from this decade, or do you like them all?
No, I mean, there are definitely some crappy machines. I remember, I forget the model, but a buddy of mine in high school had a Renault, and it was like a mid '80s Renault. Jason, throw me a name.
Like an
Alliance. Yes, Alliance.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? It was kind of boxy-ish.
Yeah.
And I remember
So it could be an Encore, it could be an Alliance. Did it have a trunk or not?
it was the Alliance. It was the
Okay.
Alliance. And I remember getting in that and being like, this is before I really dove into cars. But I was like, this is a proper shitbox. Like, this is really bad. And he knew it too. And he's like, yeah, it's pretty terrible. And the car was relatively new. It was like 2 years old. And I was like, this is terrible. You know, I mean, from a quality perspective, the only thing really worse was like the Yugo or the first generation Hyundai Accent, right?
XL,
So-
the Hyundai XL.
The XL.
And
Yeah.
right. So, you know, it's interesting. One of the worst decisions Motor Trend ever made, other than giving Johnny Lieberman a regular paycheck, is
Amen.
awarding the Renault Alliance Car of the Year honors.
That's right.
You know, but it's funny you bring that up. So, Terry, do you remember? I think it was our senior year of high school. The Yugo GV came out at 37 something, and the Hyundai XL came out at 49.95. And you looked at it, and it had like rubberized, almost Trabant-like door panels made of cardboard. They could have been Duraplast. You know, are those your worst cars of the decade, or do you have another candidate?
Well, I was looking. I didn't even consider those because they were so awful. I was looking more at a car that tried to be good and just failed, which again was that 8081 Trans Am Turbo. The car itself still, you know, goodness, because it was the same car we had before, but the attempt at replacing the drivetrain with something modern just fell flat. I well remember the Yugo coming out, and I remember the first Hyundais. I think the Hyundai actually made the Yugo, or the Yugo made the Hyundai look good. The Yugos were just awful, and I could recognize that they were Fiat mechanicals when they came out, which certainly also did not make me like them anymore. Yeah, I mean, there were some lousy cars, and I don't think anybody ever really took the Yugo seriously. And it's funny, the Hyundai seemed more conventional, and of course, you know, they steadily improved from there. But yeah, I was looking at just the kind of failure of that Turbo Trans Am in the beginning of the decade as kind of a low point.
Jason, what is your least favorite car of the decade?
So this is really interesting that I would go right after a discussion of that Trans Am and Yugos, because we're talking about the breadth of the cars in the 1980s, right? And we had genuine shit piles, the likes of which people don't understand today. And then we had the other extreme, which is where I'm going to go for my worst car, the Porsche 959, which wasn't a terrible car.
I'm sorry. You made fun of me for the
Brad's going to go through the screen and choke you.
Just wait.
I'm interested to see the way this one's going to go.
You're going to have to listen to the explanation for this because it doesn't make sense initially. Let me also say I love the 944, especially the way it looks. But the 959 was the car that predicted everything that's terrible about modern cars. Porsche got a crystal ball together and they said, we're going to make a computer-controlled, turbocharged, soulless, four-wheel drive, does everything for you, adaptive everything appliance that makes going fast the priority. And that is the last thing anyone wants from any car, especially a sports car, is to go fast with ease. That's called the GT. Those are called Bentleys. They should be 6,000 pounds and should be coddle you in luxury. Porsche started the 959 recipe incorrect. It should have been let's have some fun. And like Gordon Murray has done with every car that he's ever done, where we're like, oh, it happens to be the fastest car in the world, but it's actually the most amazing car to drive. Porsche was like, let's take the driver out of it and make it miserable. And so for that, I hate the 959 and everything it stands for.
So Brad, so Jason thinks the 959 is a soul-sucking German appliance. What say you?
I was just going to say that it's, of course, it was built to go racing and it was built to go fast. And it obviously didn't get the chance to do that, which I think is a detriment to history. But yeah, I'll agree with you. I've driven a 959. It doesn't feel super special.
What's more fun, that or a Prelude? Or CRX?
Yeah.
Or a Celica, or a Scirocco, or a GTI, or an E30, or a 944, or a Turbo Trans Am, because at least that was fun in its suckage.
And you're not wrong. You're not. The terrible part about that thing is you're not wrong. You're not.
I have a
And
law
I don't
school
think
degree. I
anybody-
can argue anything.
But, you know,
If there's a lesson here, if you're gonna suck, have fun doing it, and if you're gonna go fast, build an RS clone, not a computer clone.
Right.
So
the world according to me, anyway.
yes, which is the only voice that counts in this panel. Brad, I got it. You know, we did a little preparation for this, and this has really stuck out in my head because I know you a little bit. You don't strike me as being that odd, but I question that analysis. So I asked you all for your most unique pick of the decade, and you gave us literally the automotive equivalent of diarrhea on wheels.
Oh, come on. Oh, come on. No, the most unique car of the decade was the coolest thing to ever come out of Florida, the Mosler Consigliere GTP. It was 2.2 turbo Dodge in a mid-engined car that just took the performance envelope to anything else that was made that decade. Warren Mosler was a genius, and I will not take slander against him.
But by the way, I think the Zimmer Golden Flash also came out of Florida, so there is certainly some competition. Mike, what do you think? You know what the Consigliere looks like, right? It looks like a kit car.
I've driven one. I've driven one.
God.
Yeah, honestly, they were good on I thought they were awful looking. I thought they were terrible looking with they had Pep Boys wheels on them and everything else, but they were good cars. They were fast. They handled great. They had a good chassis.
They were good
That's
race cars.
They were good race cars. That's what they were meant to be.
Is
Race cars. Yeah.
There's a reason it's not my favorite car. It's my most unique car. It's not pretty, but it's very unique. There's nothing else on the road like it.
All right. Well, Mike Musto, let's go for unique for you.
Jesus. Unique. I'm gonna say a Cyclone pickup truck, and I know that sounds a little weird. At the time when those came out, I used to road race motorcycles, and I was on this old, late 80s 750 Pantomotor Ducati that I had bought, and I pulled up next to a Cyclone at a light, and it roasted me. And it's the first time I had ever lost a drag race to a car on a motorcycle before. And I literally chased the guy down, made him pull over, and I was like, you need to just explain this whole thing to me. It was the first time a car ever shot out of the hole like that. And I was like, what the fuck is this magical thing? And it was a pickup truck. And I was like, this doesn't make no sense. That stuck with me because I wasn't used to losing on two wheels ever. And the fact that it did it on Route 347 out on Long Island, and some random dude just crushed me. So the uniqueness of that, it was my first taste of, oh my God, this was visceral performance next to me. And it didn't sound like a V8, and it took off like it came out of a slingshot. Yeah, it just, to me, that was one of the coolest things ever.
Jason, what's your candidate?
I would love to agree with Mike about the Cyclone, but as much as I love that, it was my favorite American car of possibly ever. Subaru XT Turbo.
Rosie!
Yeah, we have a friend of ours who just bought one, and I've always thought they were cool. And I just spent 2 hours at the end of a Cars and Coffee. There's just me and Mike and this other Mike who bought it, and that car in the parking lot. Everyone else had gone, and I couldn't stop playing with it because it's just the most unbelievable compilation of stupid 80s excess meets Jackie Chan's character in Cannonball Run meets cocaine meets I don't know what the hell anyone was thinking doing that car. To the point where I'm doing a video on it next week. I have to. It's so nuts.
So Jason, that is the single steering wheel, single stalk.
It's got a 90 degree. Yeah, it's got like a 90-degree spoke, which makes the steering wheel look like a Pac-Man if you turn it the right way. But I mean, here we have a 2-seat sports coupe that's front or all-wheel drive with a manual in it, with a turbocharged 1.8-liter flat 4. With height adjustable suspension, a fully digital dash, and not one single control in the car is normal. Nothing. I mean, the heater is by your left thigh. It's just the car is just completely nuts with a coefficient of drag of 0.32, which was 0.29. Just completely out there. Nuts.
That is a fine choice for unique. Terry, can you match that with anything? The bar is high.
Yeah, I think he's outdone me. I was going for the car I found most interesting in the decade, not most unique. I wasn't looking for something really weird, and I've already spilled the beans on this one. I was looking at those original M series BMWs because they just kind of blew my mind. That original M3, I told you that anecdote, and then the M6 and the M5. Hey, there's that same engine, only bigger. And again, just that it was like the shackles are off. We don't have to worry about emissions and safety. We've got that covered. Let's just start making cars as cool as they can be again and make them hot rods, essentially. And it turned out to be kind of a brief window in time. M cars, of course, continued on, but they got watered down, even though they got faster and technically better. Those original raw ones were really pretty cool.
Well, I think the analog nature of that generation of M cars stands in sharp contrast to what you have today. And as proof that time flies when you're having fun, we originally had scheduled this as a 45-minute discussion. We are now at almost 30 minutes over that mark. So with that, gentlemen, I am going to bid you adieu. I cannot tell you how much I have enjoyed this. Jason, you were everything we thought you would be. Mike, you are exactly who we know you are. Brad, I'm sorry for the bald joke. That was a low blow. But Terry, thank you for being the adult in the room, as always. This has been Hemmings Club 54. Look at cars from the 1980s with Brad Brownell, Mike Musto, Jason Cammisa, Terry McGean. I am your host, John Nickus, and tune in next time. Thank you so much for being here.